episode of Dialogues. Today I'm talking to Jeremiah Johnson, who's the host of the Neoliberal Podcast, and actually it's a joint episode. We talk about what it means to be a neoliberal, a new liberal, a progressive, or just a liberal, and what it means to be a liberal today, what it means to update liberal principles for the challenges we face, from the authoritarianism on the right and on the left, the history of this terminology, the use of identity politics. Jeremiah argues that we live in an identity politics era, and so you should lean into that. And that's part of the attempt to recapture this idea of neoliberalism, which is now part of the Center for Neoliberalism at the Progressive Policy Institute. We question whether or not liberals have to be Democrats now. We talk about race-conscious policies in light of some of the culture war issues that are going on. And we each recommend some further reading on these whole issues of liberty, liberalism, neoliberalism, etc. So pretty wide-ranging discussion, which I really enjoyed. I hope you do too.
Welcome, everyone, to a joint episode of the Neoliberal Podcast and Dialogues with Richard Reeves, a new podcast from Richard Reeves. I'm the host of the Neoliberal Podcast, Jeremiah Johnson, and I'm joined today by Richard Reeves. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he's the host of the new podcast, Dialogues with Richard Reeves. And today we're doing a joint podcast to talk about liberalism, what's going on in the world right now, and how we update liberalism for a world that's very different, from when the original liberals were thinking. So welcome to this joint episode, Richard.
Well, welcome to you, Jeremiah. I'll introduce you. This is going to be fun. My first joint episode. So thank you for agreeing to do this. Your listeners will know who you are, but Jeremiah Johnson is the director of the Neoliberal Project and host of the Neoliberal Podcast, which you're listening to. And I really hope we're going to start with, I can't remember which philosopher it was. I always think it was Bertrand Russell, but it wasn't, who said, I spend my mornings clarifying a few concepts, and my afternoons making a few distinctions. And so I think, actually, I'm really hoping you can help me out with some of this, Jeremiah, around what we're talking about here, and where the neoliberal project sits and what that means for some of these broader issues too. I'm a recovering British liberal, struggling to figure out what to call myself in the US. So I see this as an extended therapy session. I hope that's going to be okay with everybody.
Oh yeah, and I mean, semantic arguments are always just the best arguments to get into, right?
The best for an hour, for at least an hour. Let's just spend an hour on the difference between. I want to spend an hour on the difference between new liberalism and neoliberalism.
It's funny. We have internal discussions about what to call ourselves sometimes, because the neoliberal label, and I can talk about why we choose that. It was kind of chosen for us in a sense, where in the wake of the 2016 election, if you liked Hillary Clinton rather than Bernie Sanders, people from the left would call you, you dirty neoliberal, you neoliberal shill or something. And at some point, people say that enough, and you're like, well, if being kind of a Clinton or Joe Biden or like Pete Buttigieg style Democrat is being a dirty neoliberal, then I guess that's what I am. I'm not going to apologize for that. So it started with a bit of irony. But it's also a very good way to get attention, to call yourself a proud neoliberal. I don't know. It's very good at getting attention. The downside is that obviously it has a lot of emotional baggage and a lot of negative connotations for, especially people in the academic realm. Neoliberal is kind of used as a slur word. So we have like local chapters that will call themselves the new liberals of whatever, the Texas A&M new liberals or the Nashville new liberals, rather than neoliberal. So it is actually this kind of semantic argument is something we think about all the time.
Well, I think because behind the semantics there does lie some substance. And I was looking into this a little bit, and I saw the statement from Colin Mortimer when you all joined forces with PPI saying that we wanted to poke fun at people who were calling us that word. So it's sort of the political equivalent of the word queer or something similar to that, which is you sort of do some jujitsu on it and say, okay, we're going to turn it against you. But I looked this up. I couldn't remember how long ago it was. A friend of mine, Steve Pearlstein, who writes for the Washington Post, or actually he's stopped writing for the Post now, but he wrote a joint review of my book and another book called Broken Ladder, and he asked me what I thought of it, and that's a very, he disagreed with a lot of what I said, but I said the bit that stuck with me is you called me a neoliberal. And I was a bit offended by that. And now, of course, I don't know it. That was in 2017. And that was because I was coming at it with exactly the approach you've just taken, which is in Europe and in academia, neoliberal has a very specific meaning. And most people are trying to get beyond it. And what you've all done is in this online space and with the shill and more generally, is to take it and do something very different with it. So I'm in whiplash sometimes. I'm having conversations with foundations and academics and historians and so on about getting beyond neoliberalism. And then you've all come along and you've created a space within that term, which I don't think it's neoliberalism in the academic or historical sense. I think it's sort of a pragmatic centrism to some extent. So maybe it's liberalism rather than neoliberalism. And now, and I'm going to, as we're into this now, I'll push you on it, Jeremiah, because you can help explain this to me. You've got the Neoliberal Project and the Neoliberal Podcast, which we're on now, in the Center for New Liberalism, in the Progressive Policy Institute. And obviously I know a lot of people there. So are you a progressive new neoliberal? Unpack that for me. Just like
we're claiming all of the words. They all belong to us now.
And as a British liberal, as a Mill liberal, I just think the word liberal really, wouldn't it be great if we could just use that rather than have to have all these sort of post-neoliberal, progressive, centre-left, pragmatic, technocratic, neo, whatever liberal. How about just liberal? Wouldn't that be great?
It would be. But semantic confusion being what it is, the word liberal for a long time in the United States meant, scary leftist. It's funny, the Progressive Policy Institute, today, this organization that we're part of now, progressive codes further to the left than liberal does, but they named themselves the Progressive Policy Institute in the 1980s because it was a way to get around the scary word that was liberal. In the 1980s, calling yourself a liberal was basically an insult. And so back then, Progressive Policy Institute actually registered as more centrist than being a proud liberal. So it is funny the way that all these words work. And, the origin story of us using the word neoliberal is steeped in kind of irony and second level effects of like, well, if you're going to yell this thing at me, I'm going to reclaim it. But it is interesting to think about the history of these ideas and the lineage of them. And obviously you probably know a lot more about, some of the original liberal philosophers than I do. You've written a biography of Mill, who's one of my heroes. But if we skip forward a little bit past the originals, past, Mill and some of those very, very early philosophers, and you get into the very first people to call themselves neoliberals, they were a collection of academics through the 1930s and 1940s, and they were meeting up at these conferences like the Walter Lippmann Colloquium, like the Mont Pelerin Society. And at that time, the 1930s and 40s were not a great time for liberalism. You had, actual literal Nazism on the rise. And there's world wars being fought over this. You had Stalinist communism, kind of this totalitarian, dystopian kind of leftism on the rise. And we shouldn't forget that for a lot of people, a lot of academics really thought that this kind of this wave of leftism was just the future, that, very obviously this, communism is a better way to run an economy than free market capitalism, which is too chaotic to understand anything. And this was a real thought. There were a lot of very serious economists who thought this. And so you had these liberals looking at this world thinking, has liberalism failed? Classical liberalism, this laissez-faire classical liberalism that it's normally associated with, has not done enough for us, and we need to create a new liberalism to fight, authoritarianism and totalitarianism on the right and the left. And that's where the origins of the word neoliberal come from. Is from the Hayeks and
and particularly MPS, which I know you've talked about,
particularly Mont Pelerin Society. But so I look at what we're doing as an outgrowth of that. if you think about 80 years past between the original liberal philosophers and the Mont Pelerin Society, about 80 years have passed since the Mont Pelerin Society was kicking around originally and now, and the solutions for today's problems are not the same solutions that, Hayek was thinking of in 1940. There's still a lot we can learn from Hayek and Milton Friedman and, a lot of these guys who are, Austrians and Germans who kind of created the school of ordo-liberalism. There's still a lot we can learn from them, but liberalism needs to be refreshed every once in a while. And so, maybe we are the new neoliberals. Maybe this is the latest iteration of liberalism. And what we're doing is somewhat of a self-conscious attempt to kind of revitalize liberalism, to say, liberalism still has solutions for today's problems, that you don't have to fall into this, the same traps that we're looking at, into a socialist economy or into kind of a right-wing authoritarian mindset that, liberalism has been great for the world and we should keep using it to find solutions. So
there's so much in here. I'm really glad we're having this conversation, because I think the question is whether that's the right touchstone to go back to. And I do, you said, well, let's don't worry about the 19th century. But to some extent, I think that because the 20th century was so bad for liberalism for many of the reasons that you've described, what that means is that the people you've just mentioned, Hayek, a good example, but even, I'd say people like Isaiah Berlin, Karl Popper, all the people that you've talked about quite a bit, they were reacting quite strongly against authoritarianism of one kind or another, of left or right. And in many cases, had experienced it themselves. So it's very striking how many of the people who we're talking about were themselves emigres or had experienced firsthand some of the really brutal excesses of authoritarian regimes. It's easy to forget that when you're thinking about it from more recent history. But because the reaction was so strongly against authoritarianism and such the horrific things that we'd seen in the 20th century, to some extent, the neoliberal intellectual project, I think, became too individualistic, too pro-market, almost as an ideological set of principles against authoritarianism. And you can completely see why that was the case. But my argument for going back to a different kind of liberalism like Mill is precisely because those questions, in a sense, the questions were less existential. And I think we can get into a conversation whether we're in the same place now in terms of how existential it is. But what it was really about, how do you balance liberty and authority in industrializing economies? So, how do we think about democracy? The stakes were lower for liberalism in Europe in the 19th century. I think obviously things were very different in the US, which is one of the reasons why US liberalism is such a kind of weird creature. But I do think that some of those questions that we're struggling with, just how do you make economies work, what's the balance, and a less ideological view in particular about the role of the state, which you find in 19th century liberalism, both in France and in Britain and to some extent Germany, might be more useful to us. Now, then the question is what's happened more recently. Obviously, 89 through till 2008 was a kind of a moment of hubris, of liberal triumph, where we didn't need to argue for liberalism because it was just obvious that we were winning. I think that kind of happened. And so liberals stopped fighting. And then 2008 comes along, and then we see the rise of populism and authoritarianism. And liberals are sort of looking around for the old weapons that we used to use intellectually after the last 20 years. So it's been an interesting period of horrific 19th century development, at least in Europe, horrific 20th century, pretty good end to the 20th century from a liberal perspective, then into the Great Recession and populism, not so great now. And so I do think that the project, if we can describe the project as how do we find the right tools to argue for broadly liberal principles, great. I think whether Mont Pelerin and Hayek is necessarily where one would go for that, I worry a little bit that tends towards a more libertarian direction and more towards individualism rather than individuality.
No, I'm in pretty full agreement there. I think that the Mont Pelerin crowd had a lot of reasons to be oriented in the way that they were. Obviously, the state in general was not as far-reaching as it is today. state capacity in most places around the world is a lot higher today. And so they had, more natural reasons to be skeptical of state power. They also, were living through the Holocaust and, some of the great crimes of Soviet communism. And when your foil is Soviet totalitarian Stalinism, I can understand if you have a little bit of excess going in the free market direction and extolling the virtues of free market capitalism. I will forgive you for that sin.
Yes.
Today, I don't think there's any serious philosophical argument that authoritarianism on the left, at least, is a real option. There are certainly authoritarian countries still in the world, and they pose a pretty grave danger to the world, I would argue. But within the West, authoritarianism is not really an issue for the left. The question on the left is how much government should we have in the terms of economic intervention and taxation and state programs and things like that. The question on the right is very much a question of authoritarianism. But so I look at the original neoliberals as an inspiration more for the principle of being able to update what your philosophy means in response to the times that you're living in. And I think that, I would do the same thing with them. I would change a lot of things that Hayek and Milton Friedman and, some of these guys like Alexander Rustow, and, they had valuable ideas, but we can't be stuck with those ideas. And today's neoliberals probably would argue for a greater degree of, say, welfare state spending or regulation than someone like Hayek would have. And I think that's perfectly fine. That's the world that we live in today. Sure.
Yes, because they don't see, hopefully today we don't see it as the sort of slippery slope. We're not so concerned about the overreach of the state. And I've quoted one of my favorite lines from Mill is that the interference of government is with about equal frequency, improperly invoked and improperly condemned. And so I think the correct liberal position on the state is one of agnosticism. I think it depends what it's doing. It's certainly not about the size of the state. And I think one of the problems is with the history you just identified is that for understandable reasons, which you've also described, neoliberalism or liberalism became too much about what's your view on the role of the state, right? State versus market, etc. And so it became really very overshadowed, I think, by this question of statism, rather than saying, well, it depends. Right? I mean, it's not an existential question. It's like you can imagine a state that's bigger and more liberal, smaller and less liberal. It depends what the state is using its money for. If you define liberalism properly, in my view, which is around autonomy and so on, which we can get into, then I think the role of the state becomes a hugely important question. But it's on the level of principle somewhat second order. But for years, and this is where it ended up. This is why I got offended by Steve Pearlstein's line, is because as a European, neoliberal is the sort of Thatcherite, Reaganite view that government's the problem, right? The famous line about government being the problem, not the and so on. And Thatcher was similar, at least rhetorically. And so this sense of being anti-government was really what it meant to be neoliberal in certainly growing up in the UK under Thatcher. And so I think that's why I had that reaction against it. Whereas we're surely at a point now where we can get beyond this idea of how you judge someone's politics by whether they think the state should be 35% of GDP or whatever.
Yeah, I think that you're correct here, and that what's important is how that state spending is being constructed more so than what the percentage is.
Yes.
There's certainly ways to spend a lot of money that are intelligent and that you could argue enhance freedom. There's ways to spend money that are really, really dumb and that are, would be a boondoggle. It depends on the details. I think what unifies our crowd is kind of a belief that markets are a really valuable tool and they can create an enormous amount of prosperity. And that doesn't mean that we're going to have perfectly free markets all the time, in a libertarian sense or in some sort of anarcho-capitalist sense. But it means that we recognize the value of that tool. It's an incredibly valuable tool to have in your toolbox. Free markets are very, very good at creating wealth in most situations. That doesn't mean that they're the only tool that you have. if you're as an economist, you have to think about negative externalities, monopoly power, and all sorts of conditions that exist where the state is going to be needed to step in and regulate things. You're going to need to think about what kind of social welfare function, you have in your head where, is the market creating wealth, but also creating too much inequality? And should we have a social welfare state to remedy that? Most modern neoliberals, the people who would willingly use that label today, are in favor of both, markets and a strong social welfare state. And we tend to not think that those things are opposed, that, you can have a really dynamic free market society and a strong welfare state at the same time. And, the technocratic details of that matter. Whether you're spending money in an intelligent way or a dumb way is up to the details of the program, to be honest.
Yes, and I think that's, to some extent, this is familiar territory because it's very third way-ish. I mean, it's very Clinton. I know PPI has those backgrounds. I served in the first Blair government, which ages me quite a bit, I fear. But, and then obviously, and I served in the coalition government, but I was in, briefly working on welfare reform for Frank Field, who was Blair's welfare reformist. And so to some extent, my political upbringing was during that period where the left particularly lost, especially in the UK. And then Blair came along and then Clinton. So some of that feels quite familiar to me, but there's a danger.
I would break in with a question there, just because I'm not as familiar with the political story on the other side of the pond. Why is it, do you think, that, I think it's something like only 2 labor leaders have won an election on their own in like 50 or 60 years or something. Like what actually caused the weakness of the Labor Party to the extent that we see it?
Well, that's a huge question, and one that I think I'm only partially qualified to answer. But I mean, and of course, it's partly these things. There's luck and chance and all sorts of reasons, but I mean, people from outside the UK probably don't realise the impact of the Falklands War and how important that was to Thatcher's re-election. And because that was her first term was pretty brutal economically, but then we fought and won a war, and that had quite a big impact on Thatcher's re-election. But I think it was partly because the reaction to the sense of like in the 70s that just things weren't working. and so it did need a reaction to that. There was a strong sense of, I think, if you couldn't understand why people voted for Margaret Thatcher, there was something wrong with you, in my view. If you grew up in a working class town and you wanted to do better for yourself and you didn't understand why people could, the people who just didn't understand Thatcher and thought she was evil and so on. In fact, my old boss would only hire people who could answer the question, why could people vote for Thatcher? Because there was a sense the country was broken and going backwards, and she offered this kind of new hope. And the left just went left. I mean, under Michael Foot, this is way more detail than probably want, but in the 80s just went left and left. And at one point was in favor of unilateral nuclear disarmament, for example, and very statist policies. And so it became pretty easy for Thatcher and then the Conservative Party to just keep beating that. So Labour just lost and lost and lost. There's this great line where Blair was actually under real trouble after the Iraq War and so on, and he stood up in front of the Parliamentary Labour Party and he said, look, I stood by this party through 3 election defeats. All I'm asking you to do is stand by me through 3 election victories. And it was a great Blair moment. It was a quintessential Blair, just steely, because that's what had happened. He just recaptured the centre ground. But part of it was by rejecting what was perceived as neoliberal ideology, the sense that once we'd got out of the hole, that the fetishization of the market.
It just seems so interesting to me as someone who's, outside the UK picture, obviously, that Tony Blair is the first Labour prime minister in a jillion years, roughly. And he's done it via this, third way triangulation that was ascendant in the 1990s in many countries. And it seemed like as soon as, he won 3 terms and after he left the scene, Labour quickly lost power. and they've very quickly returned to kind of this far left vision of what the Labour Party should be. And certainly it's their right to choose their own politics, but I look at the success of Tony Blair and think, how can Jeremy Corbyn be the inheritor of that? Like, why did anyone ever think that was going to work?
That's why, and that's why, of course, he was spectacularly unsuccessful too.
And it's not like Jeremy Corbyn was running against extremely talented politicians. Like the Conservative Party was vulnerable for quite a while there.
And a different leader perhaps would have had a different outcome. And obviously, British politics is just such a hot mess right now that it's very it's very difficult to draw.
Americans can't really. We don't have any space to be talking. So,
well, you're right. It's a close run thing. But one of my things I've said to my my American colleagues and friends is Trump will go, but Brexit will stay. And so I've taken the view all along that the long run damage to many of the causes that I think we hold dear, not least multilateralism, from what's happened in the UK will be greater than what's happened in the US. If the institutions of US democracy basically hold, Trump will go. I don't think he'll be able to do too much damage along the way, and he'll go, and then we'll be able to repair it. Whereas
I'm very worried about that, though. I don't take it as granted that the democratic institutions in the U.S. are going to hold. I think that if Trump taught the Republican Party anything, he taught them that you can just get away with anything. It doesn't matter, And frankly, if Trump was a little bit smarter and just a little bit more polite and couth, then he might still be president. And, the Republican Party is undertaking pretty blatantly anti-democratic power grabs in a lot of ways where, to put it very bluntly, it seems like they're just aiming to establish themselves as a minoritarian rule party into the future where they can get 47% of the vote and control all three branches of government in perpetuity. That's something I'm very worried about.
Well, I think it depends. I mean, if they're able to take power that way and hold it, and then over time to use power to corrode, undermine the institutions we're talking about, that is obviously a concern. And I look a little bit at Turkey sometimes. You see what Erdogan has done over time. So given time and the right inclination, then sure, you can start to undermine institutions quite strongly. But look at the way that every single lawsuit brought by Trump and his supporters during the last election was thrown out by the courts. It didn't matter whether they were Republican judges or Democrat judges, they were thrown out. And the Supreme Court acting in a similar way. Now, over time, would you start to lose the judiciary? Would the judiciary start? Would you start to see secretaries of state acting differently, becoming more political? Would you see Mike Pence behaving differently? I mean, these are troubling times, to be sure. You can imagine a better Trump doing a better job of undermining the institutions that we're talking about. But thus far, I think we're okay in the sense that the institutions have held, and so the damage still remains in the future. I guess what concerns me, and you've alluded to this just now, Jeremiah, is the sense that after Trump had gone, Biden wins, things will start to slide back towards more normal. Of course, the opposite has happened, partly because of January 6th, partly because Trump contains this mesmeric hold on Republicans, the way that the party's behaving. But I also think, and I don't think you've done that much on this, and I hope you'll do more, which is this sense of what does it mean? Where does knowledge come from? Where does truth come from? My colleague Jonathan Rauch, I've done a podcast with him, there's a book out on the constitution of knowledge, where both left and right are really struggling with an epistemic challenge. So what's true and who decides what's true? What are the systems of truth? And that, I think, is an underpinning problem of many of these other problems, and the capture of different kinds of social media and so on, the problems of truth and falsehood and fakehoods and so on. That, to me, is in a sense, a more troubling trend. And you even saw it in, just to take one example, quite live on the lab leak theory, right? The problems of groupthink on left and right, the overused phrase cancel culture, but the trolling and so on. And John really does a good job of this in his book of talking about just this undermining of a shared sense of knowledge. And if your project is about anything, it does seem to me to have quite a strong claim about epistemology, right? You're quite technocratic, you're quite evidence-based, you're quite you're sort of the quotes, what works, Clintonian formula and so on. So actually that's a bigger threat, I think, to the inclination of liberals. Let's talk about the liberal inclination, or the liberal disposition, which is one that's quite empirical. It is one that's quite based around facts. It is one that's based around evidence and falsifiability. That's under attack, not just from the right, but from the left as well, isn't it?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. And I'll say I haven't read the book you're referencing, but it sounds fascinating, and I might have to order a copy. What I would say is that I go back to the dawn of the internet and the early 90s, and there was this real sense among academic types, and I would say this is a very liberal point of view, that with the sharing of information, the internet is going to make all information available to everyone. It's going to be the information superhighway is what they used to call it. And there was this kind of utopian view that once this thing has been built out, everybody's going to be better informed. It's going to make everybody smarter and everybody a better person. And only positive things will come out of this kind of turbocharged information superhighway. It was a very utopian view, I think. And in a lot of ways, a lot of good has come out of the internet. To state the obvious, the internet has had a lot of really fantastic applications. But one of the things that I've soured on, and that I think a lot of other people have soured on, is the idea that it's going to help our politics and our ability to understand each other. Because what we've built the infrastructure for is kind of these separated bubbles where, correct information. It's easier than ever to learn correct information and to be well informed on just a stunning variety of topics that, in the 1980s, you simply would have never heard of or would have no ability to research without going to some university library and dragging out 10 research books that weighed 5 pounds each. Now you can just type something into Google and learn anything you want. But it's also made it easier for misinformation and hatred to be spread really, really quickly as well.
Yes.
And I don't think at the beginning of the digital age we grappled with that properly. And, it was kind of this very liberal dream that, if we just have free exchange and free flow of information, that can only be good. And it certainly is good in many ways, but we're seeing the downsides.
Sure. Actually, I've had I mentioned Jonathan Rauch already, but I had Nick Clegg come on and talk about the Trump decision on my podcast too. And he was so for those who do, Clegg was deputy prime minister in the coalition government. I worked for him, and he's now VP at Facebook, and he was pretty honest about the fact there was a sort of frothy techno-utopianism. And he's right. If you go back, it was this sense of the democratization of knowledge, and the tech people couldn't do anything wrong. And pretty quickly, it's gone to the opposite. It's gone from hero to villain pretty quickly as far as tech industry is concerned. I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic about the future. I'm not suggesting things aren't very bad now, but this stuff has happened so fast. I mean, Nick pointed out that Roger Federer was number one in tennis before Facebook was born. And so these technologies just have exploded in a way that no one really predicted. No one predicted, and that the governance structures around them they've got to catch up. We've all got to get more skilled as well. I think there's also an individual skill issue here. It's like figuring out what's good and what's bad. But I will make one distinction though. I think this gets lost a lot, which is the difference between misinformation and disinformation, or if you like, the difference between fake news and false news. The idea of there being wrong stuff out there, or crazy ideas, or eccentric ideas, and stuff that's the lifeblood of liberalism. Right? It's fueled by disagreement and eccentricity and diversity of opinions and so on. But there's a difference between doing so intentionally. Trump had this great example of this where he had this fake news awards, and in most cases they weren't fake news. The journalists got some stuff wrong, and then they corrected it. People get stuff wrong all the time, and so there's a big difference between the person that's getting stuff wrong and doing so in good faith, and then being willing to reverse their views, and the person who is intentionally, even when they're falsified, and spreading falsehoods. But I think that distinction is in danger of being lost, and that would be to the huge detriment of liberalism. Because
I think it's already been lost, unfortunately.
Well, let's take the lab back to the lab leak theory. I mean, actually, Facebook, I talked to Nick about this. Facebook banned content suggesting that COVID may have been created in a lab. They banned it, and they've now unbanned it. And he admitted that was a mistake to ban it. But the scientific consensus was it couldn't possibly be. Well, you need to be a bit careful about the scientific consensus sometimes, and you need the eccentric voices. And so it was a really good example of how, look, there could be people out there who are just well-intentioned and think it could have come from a lab, and we better listen to those people, even if they're the minority, because they might turn out to be right. They probably won't. Eccentrics typically aren't right, but occasionally are. And it was a troubling example of how this groupthink can take over.
I think the fake news thing is interesting because I feel like everyone has forgotten that it was an actual technical term for about 8 days before Donald Trump co-opted it and turned it into any news story that I don't like. It was on Facebook, there were ads being run that was literally like, pardon my language, but it was ads that would be like, Hillary Clinton has ass cancer and will die in 6 weeks. And like, that would show up, and that's literal fake news, or something just crazy like that was made up to maximize clickbait nonsense through social networks. And quickly it became any piece of news that I disagree with. But when we talk about the idea of cancel culture and the idea of things being suppressed, like the lab leak theory, and the value of these kind of eccentric viewpoints, I think we run into two fundamental issues that are at odds with each other. And one of the challenges of modern liberalism is how do we reconcile two values that don't always line up neatly and that sometimes contradict each other. The first value is the value of diversity. And you're kind of getting at this with your arguments that, we need these eccentric voices because they're not usually right, but sometimes they are. And when they are, it's very important. I think liberals tend to think there's an inherent value in diversity that, if you want to talk about the marketplace of ideas, that people can make fun of that sometimes, but I think there's an inherent value in that, and that having a free-flowing marketplace of ideas is actually a good thing. And this is how societies grow and prosper, is via that kind of healthy debate and dialogue. We're on a podcast here called Dialogues. And that's a fundamental value of liberalism. And I think liberals appreciate that for the most part in a greater way than the kind of ideological left or ideological right would, where there's more of an instinct to only say the approved things on kind of the political extremes. But what you run into is the paradox of tolerance, this is sometimes called, where, should liberals tolerate illiberal ideas? And to what degree should they tolerate them? If someone is out there on the street corner, preaching that we need healthcare reform, that's one thing. Mm-hmm. If they're out there on the street corner preaching that we need to exterminate some minority group, that's a very different thing. Mm-hmm. And it's a form of speech, but should we tolerate it? It's this kind of idea, if you tolerate illiberalism or if you tolerate intolerance, then will that not simply overtake your tolerant liberal system? And, these are the debates that we're having, I think, because those two ideas are in conflict sometimes. And there's no perfect rubric to decide when are we going to allow a certain kind of speech collectively? When are we going to harshly sanction that speech? We're just kind of stumbling through that problem. And it's an especially, we've done this forever. This is McCarthyism in the 1950s. This is, every free speech debate that's ever been had, but it's especially potent right now because of our information networks that do such a good job of amplifying controversial content, I think.
Sure, amplifying and accelerating. So that's the big difference, I think, is that it's not the guy on the soapbox in the corner of Hyde Park, where I come from, saying whatever they want to say. and being free to do that. And actually, Mill was one of the people who argued you should be able to speak freely in public parks when Disraeli tried to stop people from doing that. But how far could they really reach? And I guess you could say the same about National Enquirer. Who read it, who would, and you'd know what you were doing. You could discern which content was which. Whereas now there's an accelerant and an amplification. Sure, I think we're all going to catch up with that. I think I even notice it, like in my own adult kids, how much better they are at recognizing clickbait when they see it. They might still click on it, but they know what they're doing, and discerning the value of sources. And so I think there's a lag here on this ethic around the skills. But the questions about the limits of free speech are not new, of course. They're asked in a different way because of social media, but they're as old as the hills. And the arguments about how far you should be able to go are ongoing. And clearly, if it's incitement to violence, or incitement to crime, that's long been accepted as beyond the pale. But we're not in that space right now. We're in a space where actually even, we're not talking about people who are going around saying we should exterminate a minority. Of course, that should be curbed. But it's just more different views about different things. I've mentioned the lab leak theory already, but there are lots of areas where you really do want a sense of open dialogue. And I guess the other thing I would say on this is, the concern I've got is the constructive engagement of ideas. So I think we talk about the exchange of ideas, but much more important than the exchange of ideas is the engagement of ideas. I've likened the exchange of ideas sometimes like exchange of gunfire. Okay, but who's better off as a result? What you really want, and this is a very John Stuart Mill thought, is what he called the collation of ideas. And so one of the reasons you want to hear from a bunch of people, even if you think they're really very, very different to you, and sometimes like borderline crazy, is because you might take 1% of what they've said and go, that's interesting. Yeah, that makes me think differently about that. Maybe just like a little bit of what they're saying is true. The idea that there's truth A and falsehood B, and you put them into combat, that's one of the problems with the marketplace of ideas analogies, like one winner. Well, actually, what you really want is the sense of like different people bringing different things to the party, and collating those ideas, learning from each other through constructive disagreement. And the problem with the bubbles you've just identified is, and maybe this happens to you too, is that the people who go on the Neoliberal podcast and the people who go on they all agree with each other. And so you have this sort of sense of, it becomes a sort of cheerleading, it's just a cheerleading echo chamber. But actually what you really want to be doing is engaging with the social conservative communitarians.
We try to have a pretty good range of opinions.
I have listened to enough to know that you do disagree with each other, but it's a danger for all. It's a danger for all of us, though.
We've had socialists on in a number of instances. We've had social conservatives on. And then, the people who are a little bit closer to our camp, mainstream liberals, libertarians who lean more towards the practical side of libertarianism. We have a lot of different types, but it is a danger, the bubble aspect. I would add that the incentive structures of how we've set up our social media really matter. A conversation I just had recently with the CEO of Substack. We talked about that, using the internet, you can kind of build a heaven or a hell. And the incentive structures for how you build this stuff really matter. If you build a blogging style internet where everybody has to write long, thoughtful posts to get attention, and you respond to those long, thoughtful posts with long, thoughtful posts on your own blog, that seems like the kind of healthy dialogue and, that you're thinking of when you think of this marketplace of ideas and people really responding to each other constructively, even if they disagree a lot. If you think about something else like Twitter, which is the hell site that everyone comes to hate, but that no one can quit because its dopamine button is so good, the incentives on Twitter are very much to just dunk on people and to slam them and to, get a quip in, a pithy insult. And it's possible to have good conversations on Twitter, but it's very difficult via the nature of, you only have 280 characters or whatever it is. And it's built such that you can quote tweet someone and, dunk on them, and all your followers will give you likes and replies and that say, yeah, you showed them, you insulted them. Good job. And I'm as guilty of this as anyone else. I get caught up in it. We've gotten a lot of Twitter followers by playing that game, and I'm not sure how I feel about it when I talk about it in a rational light, but that's what the incentive structure of Twitter is it's built to maximize, my group attacks your group and your group rallies and attacks me, and it turns into a big, ideological, identity-based free-for-all. And so I think about that. Just I don't have a clean conclusion or an answer for you here, but I think
agree.
About the incentive structures.
I think incentives massively matter for sure, and I think that therefore, as institutions, we have to think pretty hard about what are our incentives. So within think tanks or newsrooms, what are the incentives? And so some famous, an example of this is a news site where the number of listeners that people were, not listeners, I should say, readers, was shown on a board live in front of the journalists. Wow, can't imagine that when I was a journalist back in the day. And so there you've built in an incentive structure by what you measure, number of followers, etc. And so I think how do we incentivize and reward people is hugely important question for us going forward. But take Twitter as an example. Now you have to, even just the nudge of would you like to read the article before you retweet it? I mean,
that is pretty funny that was a big enough problem they had to do that.
But come on, I mean, even occasionally, because I tell you what, because you get to trust certain people, and so you think, yeah, I can probably retweet them without reading it. But would you like to read it? And it's almost like that, the conscience, the voice of your own conscience saying, yeah, you really should read this, Richard, before you retweet it. And so you're like, okay, but that puts a bit of friction into the system, which is really, really good. And I think what's interesting to me though about something like Twitter, and I think this is a more general problem, which is that the real value of free speech is not to be able to speak, it's to be able to hear. And this comes back to this point about collation and dialogue, which is the skill of listening and being able to listen to what you're saying and what I'm saying. I think, that's interesting, and be changed somewhat by it. I think in some ways that's a deeper problem, because what I noticed on Twitter is silence. And so it's more that that if you say a certain thing, a whole bunch of certain kind of people will retweet it and so on. But what's almost interesting is sometimes when you just say something, you're like, and there's like a deafening silence. And that may be because your followers are like, I'm not sure about that. They don't necessarily attack you, but it's a sense of not necessarily wanting to engage with it. So we get into these grooves, these very easy to follow ruts.
If you don't give them the easy hit of dopamine that makes them, by attacking the other tribe or whatever, they'll go somewhere else for the hit of dopamine. And Twitter, all they have to do is scroll down and they'll get that hit,
Yeah, so it's not very good at encouraging, that is back to your point, I guess, encouraging engagement. And I think if there's one lesson from the liberal ideas of engagement and exchange, it is that it's not. This is what, Mill never used marketplace of ideas. I think it was Brandeis, I think. But it's why I've tried to move a little bit beyond that, because it's more, I think, about this sense of how do you create spaces and cultures and norms and incentives which are around engagement.
I think to do that, you have to have created an identity. A lot of our project is based around identity. Our theory of politics is explicitly built around identity, that all politics is identity politics. And, identity politics in the US, at least, is normally used as kind of an insult where, if you're black, you care about Black Lives Matter. If you're gay, you care about gay marriage. If you're a woman, you care about women's issues. It's this, and it's kind of used to put down, like, that's not a serious form of politics. But rather than leaning away from that, I think that the reality is that politics leans into that. And, what Donald Trump does with white rural voters and white non-college voters is very much identity politics. And even if you get into explicitly ideological projects that are built around a specific named ideology, like the Democratic Socialists of America, for instance, the DSA, even that is an identity. There are people whose identity is, I'm a leftist and I'm a DSA member. Yeah. And it comes with its everything that you could think about it an identity it comes with. It comes with a specific set of language. It comes with specific terminology that only people inside the group know. It comes with iconography. You use particular kinds of art. You listen to particular kinds of music. You have a rose emoji in your Twitter handle. You know, like this, all of this builds up into a tribal identity. And our theory is that basically all politics is identity politics in that sense. Everybody's appealing to some kind of identity group, whether it's traditionally a traditional identity or not. And so if you want to have norms around discourse and, you know, the exchange of ideas in a productive way, you have to build an identity that values those. It can't just be you going around to a bunch of other identities saying, please do this. You have to build your own tribe where that is a value. And that's part of what we're explicitly trying to do, is build a political identity that values these sort of things, that values the exchange of ideas in a productive way, and that values, you know, the core liberal principles, the classical freedoms of speech and religion and action and, you know, those sorts of things. Because I think it's the only way you can really build a movement that lasts.
Well, that's yes. I've heard you say that before, Jeremiah, and I think it's a very interesting claim, and I think it's I'm pretty persuaded by it. And Ezra Klein, I think, has also written about like all politics as identity politics to some extent. I think and I work at the Brookings Institution. That's my day job, and so there I think there is a similar sort of culture of engagement and of ideas.
You know, I work at a think tank as an identity. If you meet somebody else from a think tank, you'll have similar language, similar life experiences, similar stories. You know, it's a whole DC Insider is an identity, right? Like, all of these are just overlapping identities to me.
Yes, what would hope also that there are certain, being an academic or being in certain would also imply not just an insider tribal identity, you're right, but also a way of engaging with the world, and in particular a way of engaging with ideas and facts and evidence and so on too, which I think is true of some think tanks more than others perhaps, but it is a sense of it is a kind of claim about the production of knowledge. I think the challenge, and this is a question for you, and something I really struggle with too, is whether or not the sorts of values that liberals have are sufficiently emotionally engaging. I think you're doing a really good job of making this a tribe, and it's fun, and you talked about the iconography and so on. But the problem that us liberals, if I can say that for a moment, have is that things like the rule of law, evidence-based policymaking, pluralism, respectful disagreement, don't have quite the same emotional excitement as the blood and soil populism of the right, very often religiously inflected, and the social justice clarity of the left. They have the better tunes, don't they? Whereas we say, so what we end up saying is it's complicated.
It's easier to create propaganda for a simple idea than for a complex idea, I think.
Correct.
You're totally right.
Yeah, it's nuanced. I mean, liberalism is definitionally a more nuanced and complex approach to the world, because the world, we think, of course we would say this, but the world is nuanced and complex. It's very rarely the case that, you know, A is 100% right, B is completely wrong. Everything's clear. If you just saw things my way, and so I think to that extent, maybe the challenge is bigger because those presumptions about how you run a society are being challenged in a way that they haven't been for some time, although we talked about the 20th century earlier and so on, but certainly for the last few decades anyway, that this sense of the broad liberal consensus being largely accepted. And liberalism was actually the space in which politics used to be done. Now, liberalism has to have a politics of its own. And that's a huge shift.
I think you're correct in that it's harder to create that kind of emotional pull of an identity, of a tribe, when you're not at kind of a simplistic extreme. If you're just, you know, eat the rich and burn down capitalism. Capitalism is to blame for all our problems. Eat the rich, you know, viva la revolucion. It's a very simple idea. You know, it doesn't require a lot of, you know, hard thinking to think about, you know, how do I create songs and images and messages that are going to be based on that. Similarly, on the right, if your idea is just, foreigners and degeneracy are to blame for all of our problems and, reject modernity, go back to tradition, it's a pretty simple idea. And the idea that the world is complex and technocratic, but always, slightly improving over time. Mm-hmm. And we've just got to keep muddling through and coming through these messy fixes because society is dynamic and we should embrace dynamism rather than staying in a static view of the world. That's a little harder. Mm-hmm. One of the ways we get around that in a practical sense, and this, I'll say this is from a U.S. perspective, from other nationalities may have a different approach to this, but we tend to build some of the identity not just based on the abstract liberalism, but on some of the concrete policies that we're chasing after right now. For us, a lot of this is, a very globalist view. We're very pro-immigration. Mm-hmm. We're very pro-trade. We are generally in favor of international institutions. Obviously, not every international institution has been perfect in every instance, but this is generally our worldview. And so, people who use the globe emoji on Twitter to signify that they are liberals know that comes with, a set of jokes about how, we want taco trucks on every corner. Uh-huh. We want, open borders and free trade. And, we think container ships are the most beautiful thing in the world. And, there's kind of this set of policy beliefs that you can have both as serious policy beliefs, but also inside jokes to communicate like we're members of the same tribe. We get each other. We use the same language. Because on a fundamental level, that's almost always what humans want, is to know that I'm accepted. I'm part of the tribe. I'm welcomed here. And, if we can do that and then also sneak in the ideas of, part of our ethos online is liberalism is a big tent. We don't fight with each other if we believe different things about welfare policy or whatever. This is a big tent. We exchange ideas. If we can use the taco trucks jokes to smuggle in some of these liberal values about the value of exchange and the value of kind of polite discourse, then we've succeeded.
Yes, and I observe that. I'm sort of a generation. I turned 50, so I'm of a generation that's straddling these two worlds. I think where I'm observing what you're doing online, and most of the policies, of course, I agree with. And they are tribal signifiers, I think, is what you're saying, and probably sensible policy as well. I guess my slight concern is particularly given, this is a very parochial question, but given where you are now, kind of PPI and so on, is that some of the agenda does sound, it feels quite Clintonian, it feels quite Blairite. And look, that's me, you're talking about my world, where I come from. But I think some of the challenges from the center-right, I guess Niskanen would fall pretty much into this orbit too, the Niskanen center. But I think some of the tensions around, for example, like religious liberty, those have to be taken seriously by liberal pluralists, I think. And I don't see quite as much of that engagement, but perhaps I'm just missing from your quotes, the neoliberal tribe, as I would like to see. It started to feel a bit too comfortably centre-lefty, technocratic, Cass Sunstein, Bill Clinton, PPI, maybe a bit of Brookings. And, I go down there. You had Jenny Schutz on. She's the best housing scholar I know. Great. But it starts to feel a little bit sort of centre-left technocrats. But actually some of these other issues around, well, how do you strike a balance, for example, between the desire for anti-discrimination protection and the rights of civic institutions, including religions, to their own values? Those are tough questions. And I don't know if you've gone far enough in that direction yet. Is that fair?
Potentially. I'll say that just, at least from our perspective and in the world that we operate in politically, I don't see the kind of religious liberty questions being a massive topic of debate. Even the conservatives that I follow just don't seem to talk about it very much anymore. I don't know. Maybe it's because the conservatives that I follow are not the right conservatives. But I just, at least in the US, I don't see there's some of that, but it seems to be a very limited conversation around religious liberty, and normally this is tied into like questions of respecting LGBT rights and where the boundary is between one of those things and the other.
Yeah,
I don't know. We don't say a lot about it.
No,
but,
it's just I think there's more. I think there's a lot more of it than you're seeing. If you take people like you take the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and Jonathan Rauch, I've already mentioned in his book, he wrote a joint op-ed with Peter Weiner from EPPC, and looked at how Utah actually came to an agreement on this. This was in the context of the Equality Act and so on too. And so I kind of throw that as an example of it's a bit more of a cultural issue. It's somewhat more, looks a bit more towards the right, because I can assure you that a lot of conservatives are very worried about, sensible conservatives who are worried about the overreach of the state in the guise of equality. And I don't think they're crazy to be worried about some of that. Bill Golston, my colleague at Brookings, writing about liberal pluralism, for decades now, I think, is this idea of how do you tolerate those differences within a plural society. They're somewhat more cultural. They're probably a little bit more on the center right and so on. Right now, the project, as I understand it, is very much in this quite a technocratic space. Housing, immigration, trade, criminal justice reform, occupational licensing, all that great stuff. And I think that's good, but I think some of these questions about culture, you take conservative writers like David French, for example, and pluralism, I think some of them run a bit deeper. And I think that the liberal project has to encompass some really interesting conversations about some of those issues too. I think you're avoiding the culture war by staying in the policy lane, and I get that totally, but I worry a bit whether the bigger threat to liberalism, as I think we've both been talking about it, doesn't come from some of those cultural issues as opposed to whether or not you're in favor of exclusionary zoning.
I would say that it's not a clear distinction what is a policy issue versus what is a culture issue. For instance, immigration. Immigration is both a detailed policy issue where you can have very detailed wonkish beliefs about H-1B, but immigration is very much a culture war, and we are very much in the middle of a culture war. We're the extremists on one side saying open borders, so it's a spectrum, I guess. There's there's shades of gray in between pure policy talk and pure culture war stuff. I think it's just a difficult question. I do think that our identity, the identity group that we're crafting, tends to lean into, we are technocrats. We are the kind of people who like to get into wonky policy detail. And we lean into that. Whether that's a good strategy or not, time will tell, I guess. But it's something that's been happening. So we do kind of lean very heavily on the people who are interested in policy, the people who are, highly educated. And it's something, we're going to have to grapple with as we grow. How do you, because I see two different distinct brands of kind of how do you approach a center-left politics. And one is, you could call it the working class argument, where you kind of go to the right on culture. And, you look at like Bill Clinton's version of center-leftism. It was very much like, beyond just all the welfare cuts that he wanted to do. And, we need welfare reform. We need to make the system tougher. You look at Bill Clinton talk about immigration. He was very tough on immigration. He was, illegal immigrants go home. We need border security, blah, blah, blah. And it was very much this kind of like, let's move to the right on cultural issues. Democrats were terrified to come out in favor of gay marriage because it was just a crushing issue for a long time that just the Republicans would beat them over the head with and win. And that's one version of how you go to the center left, is you moderate a little bit on this kind of immigration, or you moderate on, cultural values, whether that's, giving space for religious liberties, as the conservatives would call them. Another way that we're kind of seeing if there's a path forward for is what I would call like a globalist center left, where you're proudly capitalist, but, you're not rejecting the institutions of immigration and international trade. You're in favor of a pretty strong welfare state, but you're not going to the right culturally, on things like LGBT rights or immigration or things like that. So I don't know. There's a couple different versions of this.
I think that's right. And the pod you did with Colin a while ago, Colin Mortimer, had social liberalism. You actually had to have social liberalism as part of his manifesto of what it meant to be neoliberal. And it's looking back on this, the Clinton years were eye-wateringly socially conservative. It was Defense of Marriage Act. We had obviously the criminal justice bill, the death penalty spiking during. Talking to Liz Bruenig about that.
Bill Clinton felt the need to fly back to Arkansas to oversee a death row a death row execution
because he was on the campaign trail, and so he had to be there to execute this African American guy, and so Ricky Ray, if I'm remembering correctly, and so it was extraordinary marriage. And so obviously the world has hugely changed since then and massively for the better. And so, but I think the challenge is, particularly in a country like the US, where there is still such huge cultural diversity and where the right, I think, are going to play these kind of cultural tunes pretty loud, is to go back to this idea of pluralism around values and culture. And so, because otherwise there's danger that we lose the value of pluralism. And this is not tacking to the right on social conservatism, but it is about recognizing that there are many issues we're not going to agree on. And how do we find a way to disagree on them and still live together in peace, trade with each other, get richer, do all the good stuff, rather than breaking ourselves into pieces over those cultural issues. And so, like it or not, I think we do have to engage with them a bit more.
And the one thing I'll say is, I wish I had thought of this earlier, because I think this is perhaps the most comprehensive answer I could give to the question of the religious liberties question. I actually think I would disagree in the diagnosis that this is going to be one of the motivating questions of the next decade of politics. I actually think that we're moving out of that phase, that this was the motivating question of the last decade of politics as we grappled with gay marriage and whether bakers in Colorado should have to bake a cake for a gay wedding. I think that race is really going to be the motivating factor of a social conservative push over the next decade, that Black Lives Matter has exploded. And it's also raised this question of, not just what does it mean to be Black in America, but what does it mean to be white?
Yes.
If you are a white rural conservative, you, for the first time ever, kind of have to think about your whiteness. You're forced to confront your whiteness in some ways. And that's, not something that voters have typically had to do. And so there's a lot of pushback over are we doing racial justice in the right way? And I think that, even some progressives have basically said, the racial justice stuff is going overboard, not because racial justice is a bad idea, but because if you want racial justice, progressives have to hold power, and you're not going to hold power if you keep communicating in this kind of academic seminar way that you try to communicate with the public, where you teach them about white fragility or whatever, fashionable nonsense is going on in the halls of academia, that, white voters, you still need to win those voters. And I don't know. I think that's the big challenge, is going to be dealing with race issues. And, can liberals and progressives not alienate white voters while still making tangible gains on racial justice? Matt Iglesias talks about this a lot, that like his line is something like, Democrats should do racial justice without calling it racial justice.
Yes.
Without ever mentioning that it helps any particular racial group, like the child tax credit. Just by nature of how many people from each race have how many kids, the child tax credit will disproportionately benefit Black and brown families by a lot. But it would be a mistake, according to Matt Iglesias, to go out to the public and say, because of racial justice, because of white oppression of Black people, we need a child tax credit. It's better to just say, let's help parents. We shouldn't have kids in poverty. Let's help parents. and let it happen kind of naturally.
Yes.
I think these are the ways that we have to do this without ever, saying, oh, well, I'm going to respect your view, open exchange. Like it doesn't have to be that explicit as much as do simple things to not alienate people who disagree with you.
Yes, I've argued for what I've called race-conscious policies, which I think is what you're talking about there and what Iglesias has written about, which is it's not race-blind, so you're aware that there'll be different impacts for different racial groups, but it's not race-based in the sense of this is only going to be for a particular group. And child tax credit is one example of that. I just did some work with Scott Winship at AEI, where we showed that most third generation poor people in the US are black. It's like 83%. So let's say you had a wealth transfer policy that focused on people who were in the third generation of poverty in their family. That would be a massively pro-African American policy, but there'd be some whites would benefit from it too, just not very many. And so that would be an example of a race-conscious policy. And I think that is probably broadly the direction to go in. My fear is there's still just going to be enough of an argument about the historic treatment of Black Americans and the anti-Black racism that I think has continued to disfigure American politics for so long that something, I think the moral arguments for reparations and so on have always been quite strong. It's obviously so late, and the US has gotten itself into such a terrible position on all of this by failing to recognize this stuff earlier and deal with it earlier. But I do wonder if there isn't some sort of combination of a genuine, as much a cultural reckoning, and then a moving on with race-conscious policies. I don't think that the moment is just going to pass. I used to think time would heal. I used to think the trend lines are going in the right way, that the right policies and patience and respect, and we'll get there. But I don't see the trend lines for a lot of Black Americans, especially Black men, actually, just not moving. And so I worry that we have to do something. I don't know what that something is.
I think it's no single cause. This is going to be a multi-causal kind of thing where, if we get criminal justice policy fixed to some extent, that's going to help. And again,
Sure.
It's not something you have to sell as, you don't have to sell, weed should be legal as a racial justice thing. You certainly can, but you can also just sell it as, weed should be legal.
Yes.
And, that and just a less punishing carceral state would be very valuable. I think that welfare state policy has something to do with this. I think housing policy has something to do with this. And it's just going to take lots of chipping away at lots of policies. I'm still pretty optimistic that racial justice will continue improving over time. We're still not that far away from, the U.S. being an apartheid state. It was 50 or 60 years ago that, we were essentially an apartheid state, not that different from what South Africa was. But, things change, and the history of the U.S. in a lot of ways is the history of white supremacy. We were a slave state for most of our existence. And then in 1860, we freed the slaves, but, another 100 years existed where we were an apartheid state.
Yes.
And that doesn't go away just after 1 decade or 2 decades. The echoes continue. But in general, I just, I guess this loops back into the conversations about, is liberalism in danger, and how do we react to that? Because I'm in a very sensitive spot right now where I just don't think the Democrats functional. And if you're talking about a party of liberalism in the United States, it's the Democrats. The Republican Party is in a very bad place right now. So if we're frank and we say that Democrats need to continue to hold power because Republicans are playing, games with democracy that are deeply troubling. I am very concerned with the Democrats continuing to hold power. And so if that means messaging things in a certain way to appeal to more socially conservative voters, then so be it. That's how we have to message them. And, if we were in a better place, we could have that conversation about, should we be more explicit in our messaging? But right now, I think just my personal view of the danger of the illiberal moment is quite high. So I'm very sensitive to things that would like lose the democratic hold on government for what I would consider to be very silly reasons. So I don't know. That's where I come down on this.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot to be said for that. I agree that right now, the best hope for the sorts of policies that we've been talking about, and I would say not just policies, but inclinations and approaches are to be found in the more sensible reaches of the Democratic Party, for sure. And so holding power and holding off a Trump-like candidate from retaking the White House is arguably the most important political task in front of us. And so I tend to agree that everything else can, in these kinds of moments, has to be somewhat second order to that. Then what that means in terms of the political calculation is something that fortunately is not my job to worry about, because the challenge between getting out your base and holding your party together and not alienating voters, independent voters, around issues like crime, for example, and immigration, which I think are going to be huge in the midterms and in 2024. That's a huge political challenge. But I do agree that if you can present compelling evidence that approach A is more likely to secure the political apparatus for Democrats, then right now, if you're a liberal, clearly that's the way to go. You can imagine a world where that's not the case, right? Where the Democrats could have gone in a different direction and Republicans have gone in a different direction. But I agree that the politics of this right now have to be weighted even more heavily sometimes than the policy technocratic side. So we should probably wrap, right? And you should probably tell me which books to read. Don't you do this thing at the end of your podcast where you ask? I should have thought about this, but
it's always my final question to any guest is, for the topic that we're covering, if people want to learn more, what should they read? This could be books, blogs, even follow this particular Twitter account because they have good insight. It can be anything, but I guess today's topic has kind of broadly been liberalism and how it applies to how it kind of applies to the current moment. So what are the works that kind of guide your thinking? And obviously you're a big Mill guy.
Big, yeah. So are you going to do it? Are you going to go as well? Seeing as this is a joint podcast, are you going to do yours?
Sure, I can absolutely
go on. You go first.
So when I think about liberalism and how I conceive of my version of liberalism, because, I call myself a neoliberal, but that is a category of liberalism. I am a liberal first, and then some subset of liberalism second. One of the things that I've read recently that I think is excellent is Adam Gopnik's 1,000 Small Sanities. That's a kind of a left liberal defense of liberalism from both the far left and the far right. He takes the time to sketch out like what are the right's problems with liberalisms? What flaws do they see? What are the left's problems with liberalisms? What flaws do they see? And why do I think that liberalism still matters anyway? These core liberal values. He's coming from kind of a left liberal viewpoint. He's a Bernie Sanders voter, for instance, but I think his core defense of the liberal project in the modern world is really good. If I was going to recommend something for a more center-right version of neoliberalism, it's Madsen Peary's The Neoliberal Mind. I think Madsen Peary is a guy who's associated with the Adam Smith Institute in the UK.
Oh, yeah.
And he wrote a little, it's not a full book. It's more like a little treatise. I don't know how you would call it. It's maybe 40 or 50 pages long, called The Neoliberal Mind, basically arguing for liberalism and kind of more a center-right liberalism, but liberalism nonetheless, and extolling what are core neoliberal values. What do neoliberals think about many of the different topics that are kind of the most important things today? So those are the two things I would recommend, the Neoliberal Mind and then 1,000 Small Sanities from maybe a center-left and a center-right liberal perspective.
Those are good choices. I actually reviewed Gopnik's book and I was impressed with it for the literary review, I guess. So I'll add it to the show notes. But the particularly strong chapter of his book, I think, is when he takes on the left, because that's where he comes from. And I think Gopnik's when he writes about the the promise and perils of intersectionality, for example, is this great line where it says we have to intersect all the way down to the individual. The problem with intersectionality is it doesn't go far enough. There are nodes in which different values come together, and those nodes are called individuals. At something like that.
When you become so intersectional, you're now Margaret Thatcher.
Yes,
It's
exactly. And I think, so that was, for me, that was the most powerful part of that book. So I really like that recommendation. So I will recommend one thing I've done with Jonathan Haidt, which is an illustrated edition, new edition of Chapter 2 of Mill's On Liberty, which is the chapter on free speech. And so it's called All Minus One. It comes back to this point about eccentrics. So I'd recommend that. I would also recommend, I've mentioned Bill Galston, my colleague at Brookings, and I'm not sure where I'd position him politically now, actually. He's very associated with Clinton and worked in the Clinton White House. But his new book is, I guess a couple of years old now. It's called Anti-Pluralism, The Populist Threat to Liberal Democracy. So I think that's a terrifically good book. One you've mentioned, I think, on this podcast before, and I'm sorry we didn't get to talk about him, perhaps we will another time, is Amartya Sen. I think you've mentioned Development as Freedom before, Jeremiah, on this podcast, but
yes.
his book, The Idea of Justice, is sort of a Sen's greatest hits. It's a tough read in some ways, but I think the idea of individualism, which underpins Sen's liberalism, is in the spirit of Mill, but respectful of Hayek, if I can put it that way, and very, very deep and grounded and practical philosophy. And so, when I'm asked who's my kind of modern hero, if Mill's my 19th century hero, then Amartya Sen is right up there. And so I would say his book, The Idea of Justice, would be a good companion to the ones we've already mentioned.
I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to talk about some of your books because, there's a lot out there. Everyone should go check out the book that Richard's done with John Haidt. It's, an illustrated version of John Stuart Mill. You should all check out Dream Hoarders. If you've never read Dream Hoarders, it's required reading, and you don't get to call yourself a neoliberal until you do.
Right.
But maybe in a future conversation. But
I would love to
guess
do more of
we'll
that
wrap
too.
it there.
Yeah, but also
I really enjoyed having you on.
Same to you. And people should check out the Neoliberal Project, which is now at PPI, and Exponents. Is that the name of your newsletter? Which I think.
Yeah. So you can find us at neoliberalproject.org. We have a magazine called Exponents Mag, which is a community magazine where, if I'm allowed to pitch that, anybody can write into Exponents. We're explicitly looking for young and developing writers, and we, provide them some editing and help them get published, so yeah.
It's fun. Well, that was great. Thanks so much for doing this together, Jeremiah. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to Dialogues. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. And if you did, please take a moment to follow, like, rate, and share the podcast in all the usual places. And send me your thoughts and ideas, including for future guests, to dialoguespod@gmail.com. That's dialoguespod@gmail.com. I'll see you next time.